The sterile hum of the galactic medical hub had always felt like home to Nurse Alara. The endless corridors of white and silver, the rhythmic beeping of life support monitors, the subtle scent of antiseptic, all of it had become a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. She had spent years mending wounds, easing pain, and doing what she had sworn to do: heal, no matter the patient. But tonight, everything changed. The emergency ward had been unusually quiet. Most of the doctors had gone for the night, leaving behind a skeleton crew of medics and drones. Alara had been preparing to finish her shift when the doors to the restricted bay slid open, and a low, pitiful sound reached her ears, a whimper, weak, almost unheard beneath the hum of machinery. She turned, frowning, stepping cautiously toward the source. There, lying on a scanning table, barely breathing, was something she had never seen in person before: a baby dragon. Its tiny form trembled under the harsh lights, its scales, once meant to be radiant, now dull gray with illness. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and when it shifted slightly, she saw the way its fragile limbs curled inward, as if bracing against some invisible pain. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Dragons were rare, and more than that, they were untouchable. Galactic law was strict. No medical aid was to be given to undocumented, unregistered creatures. Even species with intelligence, if not recognized by the Council, were left to their fate. She had seen doctors turn away the sick before, seen the cold, calculated way administrators spoke of policy, of procedures, of rules that did not bend, even for the dying. She had always followed orders. But as she looked down at the baby dragon, its small body racked with fever, she knew there was no choice to be made. It was suffering, and she could stop it. Without a second thought, she grabbed a scanner and ran it over the fragile body. The result sent a spike of urgency through her chest. A viral infection, spreading fast, already attacking its vital organs. If left untreated, it wouldn't last the night. No one had noticed her yet. No security alerts had sounded. Her hands moved on instinct. She reached for a nano booster injection, carefully adjusting the dosage. Too much would overload its tiny system. Too little wouldn't be enough. She worked fast, stabilizing its erratic breathing, wiping away the fever sweat collecting beneath its delicate wings. The baby stirred, its body responding to the treatment, and a tiny sound escaped its throat, a whimper of relief. That was when the door behind her hissed open. Alara's stomach dropped. Standing in the doorway was Chief Administrator Trick, his face a mask of controlled fury. His gaze swept over the scene. The dragon, the open medkit, the syringe still in her grip. "What have you done?" The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken consequences. Alara forced herself to stand tall, to meet Trick's piercing gaze, even as the cold weight of reality pressed down on her. She had broken protocol. The kind of rule that didn't get a warning. The kind of rule that ended careers. "I saved a life," she said simply. Trick's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, looking down at the fragile creature on the scanning table. "This is an unregistered species," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You are well aware of the Council's policies. No aid, no intervention. And yet, here you are, administering treatment." Alara could feel her pulse hammering against her ribs. She knew the rules. Of course she did. She had memorized every law, every regulation, had drilled them into her mind the way every medical professional was expected to. And yet, she looked down at the dragon, still breathing, but stronger now, no longer caught in the desperate grip of fever. It had almost died, and they would have let it. Trick sighed, rubbing his temples as if this were an inconvenience, not a life-or-death moment. "You should have reported this," he continued, his voice laced with disappointment. "We would have followed proper procedures." She let out a bitter laugh. "You mean we would have let it die?" Trick's expression hardened. "That is not for us to decide." "Then who does?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Because last I checked, I became a nurse to heal. Not to stand by and watch something suffer just because it doesn't fit into the Council's perfect little system." Trick's gaze darkened. Your emotions have no place in this field, Alara. Her hands clenched at her sides. She knew that. She had been taught that, but tonight she didn't care. Trick exhaled heavily as if already tired of this conversation. I'm placing you on immediate suspension, he said, his tone clipped. Turn in your badge and access codes. You are no longer permitted to work in this facility. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Just like that. She had known this was coming the moment she touched the dragon, but hearing it out loud, feeling the cold finality of it still sent a shock through her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached up and unclipped the medical badge from her uniform, setting it on the counter beside the scanner. The metal clinked, softly against the surface, a sound that echoed. In her ears, the sound echoed like a hammer striking the last nail in a coffin. Trick turned without another word, leaving her standing in the dim light of the emergency ward. Alara swallowed against the tightness in her throat, then looked down at the tiny dragon one last time. Its eyes, now open, clear, alive, stared up at her. A small, fragile paw lifted weakly as if reaching for her. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry, she whispered. And then, with nothing but the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the empty corridor, she walked away. The walk from the emergency ward to the exit felt impossibly long. Every step echoed in the pristine halls, each one pulling Alara further from the only life she had ever known. The Galactic Medical Hub had been her home since she was 20, her whole world contained within its walls of steel and glass. Now, she was nothing more than a stranger, leaving behind a place that no longer wanted her. When she reached the security checkpoint, a waiting officer took her ident chip, scanning it one final time before deactivating her medical clearance. The badge clipped to her uniform was already gone, surrendered without protest. The heavy doors slid open, and just like that, she was outside. A medic without a purpose. A healer without a place to call home. The artificial sky above the station was a deep shade of blue, the massive glass domes reflecting the distant glow of a nearby gas giant. Around her, people moved as if nothing had happened, as if her entire life hadn't just been ripped apart over a decision she'd make 1,000 times over. She stuffed her hands into her coat pockets, her mind numb. She had no plan, no backup, job waiting. No idea where to go. Alara had always been a rule follower, the kind of person who believed in order, in the greater good. But tonight, as she walked aimlessly through the station's marketplace, she realized that the system she had trusted for so long had failed her, had failed that baby dragon. Her feet carried her toward the outer districts, where the buildings were older, the streets dimly lit. She had been here before, back when she was just a trainee, sneaking out for late-night drinks with her friends, all of them full of dreams that now seemed so far away. She stopped outside a small diner and leaned against the railing. Inside, patrons laughed over plates of steaming food, their voices muffled by the glass. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from the gnawing sense of loss clawing at her chest. The wind carried a faint hum through the air, and she closed, her eyes exhaling slowly. She should be angry, but all she felt was tired. Then, out of nowhere, she heard a sound that made her freeze. A soft whimper. Her eyes snapped open, her body going rigid. It was faint, barely audible over the distant hum of passing shuttles, but it was there. Alara turned her head sharply, scanning the alley beside the diner. The shadows were deep, the narrow passage stretching into darkness, but something was there, something small. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step forward. Lying against the wall, half buried beneath discarded cloth, was the baby dragon. Alara's chest tightened. The little creature was exactly where she had left it. Only, it shouldn't have been here at all. The hospital would have disposed of it. The higher-ups would have ensured it was removed, that its existence was erased like a stain on a record, but instead it had somehow ended up here, abandoned, as if its life had never mattered in the first place. Alara crouched beside it, her hands hovering uncertainly. The dragon's tiny body trembled, its breath coming in shaky, uneven bursts. It wasn't burning with fever anymore, but it was still weak. Its limbs curled inward, tail barely twitching. "You survived," she whispered. The dragon made a soft, pitiful noise, a sound of recognition. Her throat tightened. Somebody had taken it out of the hospital and dumped it here. Her fingers curled into fists. This wasn't just neglect. This was deliberate cruelty. Alara's mind raced through the possibilities. The hospital had likely disposed of it quietly, not wanting any records of what had happened. No doubt they assumed it wouldn't survive the night on its own, but it had. And now it was here. Alone. Suffering. Because of them. Alara exhaled sharply, shoving aside her frustration. Now wasn't the time for anger. Moving carefully, she reached forward, letting her fingers hover near its head. "Hey," she murmured. "I'm here." The little dragon let out a tiny huff, its nostrils flaring weakly. It was too exhausted to move, but it didn't flinch away from her. "Good enough." Alara shrugged off her coat and wrapped the dragon gently, lifting it against her chest. It was small, too light, its body barely warm against her, but it didn't fight her. She held it close, feeling its shallow breaths against her skin. This was it. She had no job, no home, no future. But as she looked down at the fragile creature in her arms, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't leaving it behind. Alara didn't sleep that night. She had managed to slip into a small, run-down inn on the outskirts of the district, paying for a room with what little credit she had left. It was nothing special. A single bed, a malfunctioning climate unit, and a window that barely sealed against the chill of the artificial night cycle. But it was safe, for now. The baby dragon rested on a folded blanket beside her, its tiny body curled up tight. Its breath was still weak but steady. She had done what she could, wrapped it in warmth, cleaned its dull scales, fed it what little nourishment she could find that wouldn't overwhelm its fragile system. And still, it slept fitfully, whimpering, in its dreams. Alara sat cross-legged on the floor beside it, rubbing her tired eyes. She knew she couldn't stay here long. The hospital had made it clear. They wanted nothing to do with the creature. If they found out she had taken it, they might not come after her directly, but they would make sure she never worked anywhere in the system again. Not that she had a job to go back to. Her fingers traced the ridges along the baby dragon's spine, absent-mindedly. It was so small, barely the length of her forearm. Dragons, real dragons, were supposed to be imposing, powerful beings. But this one had been left to die in the cold. Her gut twisted at the thought. Her career was over. Her life, as she knew it, was over. And yet, as she sat in that tiny room, watching over a creature that shouldn't have survived, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. She had saved a life, and nothing could take that away from her. A knock at the door shattered the quiet. Alara froze. No one knew she was here. She had paid in cash, given no name, told no one where she was staying. The baby dragon stirred, letting out a soft whimper. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. Alara swallowed hard, grabbing the small blade she kept in her bag. It wasn't much, but it was something. Moving carefully, she approached the door, pressing her ear against it. Silence. Then a voice. "Open the door, Nursara." Her breath caught. The voice was smooth, commanding, and distinctly inhuman. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Gritting her teeth, she slid the latch open and pulled the door just wide enough to see who was standing there. Figure loomed in the dim hallway, tall and cloaked in deep, dark fabric. Their face was partially obscured, but beneath the hood, two golden eyes gleamed, slit pupils, like a serpent's. Alara's pulse spiked. This wasn't a bounty hunter. It wasn't hospital security. This was something else. The figure exhaled slowly. "You have something that belongs to me." Alara's fingers tightened around the blade in her hand. She didn't know who or what stood before her, But she wasn't about to hand over the baby dragon to just anyone. Not after everything. "You're mistaken," she said, keeping her voice even. "I don't have anything that belongs to you." A pause. Then a low chuckle. "You are bold," the figure murmured. "I expected as much." Before Alara could respond, the stranger moved, pulling back their hood in a slow, fluid motion. Alara sucked in a breath. Beneath the fabric was a woman. No, a dragon. Her features were sharp, elegant, with silver-blue scales along her cheekbones that shimmered under the dim hallway lights. Her golden eyes studied Alara intensely, as if measuring her worth in a single glance. She was beautiful and terrifying, all at once. Alara swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The woman straightened, exuding a presence that made the air feel heavier. "I am Lyra," she said, "Queen of the Draconian Realms." Alara's mind stalled. A queen, a dragon, a queen, standing in the hallway of a backwater inn staring at her. Alara had heard of the Draconian Realms in passing, a kingdom of powerful ancient beings who rarely involved themselves with the rest of the galaxy. The few times they did, it was never for anything small. And now, one of them was here. Lyra stepped forward, her gaze flicking toward the room beyond. "The child," she said. "You saved it. It is my blood." Alara's breath caught. Her blood. That meant... She turned sharply, looking at the tiny dragon curled up on the blanket. Its pale scales glistened under the dim lighting. Lyra watched her carefully. "You are surprised." Alara let out a weak laugh. "Yeah, well, didn't exactly expect to be playing babysitter for royalty." The queen studied her for a long moment. Then, to Alara's shock, she lowered herself to one knee, bringing them eye to eye. "You saved my heir," Lyra said, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "Against the laws of your kind, at great personal cost." Alara didn't respond. She didn't know how to respond. Lyra's golden gaze bore into her. "I came not just to reclaim what is mine," she continued, "but to give you what you have earned." Alara blinked. "And what exactly is that?" The queen's lips curled slightly. "A new life," she said. "One far greater than the one they took from you." Alara's heart pounded. She had lost everything for this baby dragon. But now, staring into the eyes of the most powerful being she had ever met, she realized something. She might have just gained something far, far more. The world Alara knew ended the moment she stepped onto the Draconian ship. The vessel, sleek and impossibly advanced, was unlike anything she had ever seen in human space. The hull was alive, shifting in subtle waves as if breathing. The corridors pulsed with a soft golden glow, guiding them deeper into the heart of the ship, where the very air felt charged with something ancient, something alive. Lyra moved with effortless grace, her presence at once regal and imposing. The baby dragon, her heir, was nestled against Alara's chest, still too weak to move much but stronger. She barely noticed the hushed whispers of the Draconian guards as they passed. They watched her, expressions a mixture of awe and suspicion. Human, an outsider, one who had done the unthinkable, saved royal blood without hesitation, without expectation. The queen finally stopped before a massive set of ornate doors, their surface marked with intricate carvings of dragons in flight, locked in some celestial dance. With a single motion of her clawed hand, the doors parted, soundlessly, revealing an expansive chamber bathed in the soft glow of twin moons through a panoramic window. Alara had seen luxury before in the high districts of human space. But this was something else entirely. The air smelled fresh, like the deep forests of old Earth, tinged with the faintest trace of embers, as if a fire had once burned here, but left no mark of destruction. Lyra turned, her golden eyes locking onto Alara's. "You have left your old life behind," she said. "Do you regret it?" Alara exhaled slowly, glancing down at the tiny dragon in her arms. This creature had been abandoned, left to die, and she had saved it, no matter the cost. She looked back at Lyra, meeting the Queen's gaze without hesitation. "No," she said, "I don't." Something flickered in Lyra's expression. Approval, perhaps. "You are a healer," the Queen said. "But you are also something more. You are fearless in the face of consequence. That is a rare thing." Alara swallowed, her fingers tightening around the baby dragon. "I didn't do it to be fearless," she admitted. "I did it because no one else would." Lyra stepped forward then, lifting a clawed hand. For a brief, startling moment, Alara thought she might strike her. Instead, the Queen rested her palm lightly against Alara's forehead. A wave of warmth rushed through her body. Something she couldn't describe. Not fire. Not electricity. Something older. Something woven into the very fabric of existence. It wasn't painful, but it was powerful. So much so that she gasped softly, gripping the edge of a nearby seat to steady herself. When the sensation faded, Lyra withdrew her hand. "You have been marked." Alara blinked, trying to catch her breath. "Marked?" "A healer of the Draconian Royal Court," Lyra clarified. "A title given to few, and never before to an outsider." Alara's heart stopped for a beat. She had lost her place in human society, been cast out for doing the right thing. And now she had been given a new purpose, one greater than anything she had ever imagined. She was no longer just a nurse. She was something more. The first few days aboard the Draconian vessel were unlike anything Alara had ever experienced. Her new quarters were massive, large enough to fit 3 of her old apartments inside. The walls shimmered like polished obsidian, reflecting the soft glow of floating lanterns that moved on their own accord. And Kor, the baby dragon, thrived. Under her care, his once fevered body strengthened. His dull scales began to shimmer with their rightful luster. He followed her everywhere, his small wings fluttering when he tried to keep up with her steps, but it wasn't just the luxury that struck her. It was the culture, the people, the unspoken reverence they held for their queen. She was introduced to the royal court, an assembly of high-ranking draconians, some who looked at her with curiosity, others with barely concealed distrust. "The humans do not care for our kind," one of the elder counselors had said, his tone cold, wary. "Why should we place trust in this one?" Lysara had merely smiled, sharp and knowing. "Because while your kind debated over laws and politics, she had replied, she saved my son." The room had fallen silent and no one dared to question further. Later that night, Alara stood on the observation deck staring out into the endless stretch of space, the stars burning bright against the black. The weight of everything settled on her. She had spent her life believing in the system, believing that if she worked hard enough, played by the rules, she would make a difference. But in the end, it had been compassion, not policy, that had shaped her fate. She felt Kaler nuzzle against her side, his tiny warmth a reminder of what had brought her here. She placed a hand over his small back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She had lost a job. She had lost a home. But here, among the stars, she had found something far greater. And for the first time in her life, she felt free. Alara awoke to the warmth of Kor curled beside her, his tiny body rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. In just a matter of days, he had gone from a frail, fever-ridden creature on the brink of death to something vibrant, his once dull scales now reflecting the soft glow of the chamber's floating lanterns. He had imprinted on her. That much was clear. No matter where she went, he followed, his wide golden eyes always watching, always learning. She had thought the Draconians might take him away once he recovered, but no one had tried. Instead, she found herself summoned. The Queen's private chamber was nothing like the royal court Alara had seen before. It was quieter, more intimate, with walls carved from deep violet stone that shimmered in the dim light. The air smelled faintly of embers, a reminder of the power that lurked beneath the surface of these beings. Lysara stood near the center of the chamber, watching as Alara entered, Kor padding along at her heels. The queen's golden eyes settled on the baby dragon first, and something soft flickered in them, a warmth Alara had never seen in her before. "You have done more than heal him," Lysara said, her voice smooth but carrying a weight beneath it. "You have given him a bond no healer has ever forged with our kind." Alara glanced down at Kaler, who let out a soft chirp, pressing against her leg. She swallowed, unsure what to say. "I just did what anyone should have." Lysara's lips curled, something between amusement and approval. "And yet, no one else did." The queen stepped forward, lifting a clawed hand. For a moment, Alara thought she might take Kaler away. Instead, she reached for the medallion at her neck, a deep celestial blue stone embedded within golden metal. "You saved my son, knowing there was no reward," Lysara continued, unclasping the medallion and holding it out. "Now, I offer you one." Nonetheless, Alara hesitated. "I don't understand." "You were cast aside for your compassion," Lysara said. "But here, among my people, such compassion is revered." She pressed the medallion into Alara's palm. It was warm, pulsing faintly against her skin, as though alive. "You are no longer an outsider," the queen declared. "From this moment on, you are a healer of the Draconian court. You will walk among us as one of our own." Alara's breath caught. The title alone was staggering. It wasn't just an honorary gesture, it meant she had a place here, a purpose, a home. She curled her fingers around the medallion, feeling its weight. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Lysara's golden eyes gleamed. "Then say nothing. Simply accept what you have earned." Kaler nudged at Alara's hand as if urging her to take it. She smiled, exhaling softly. She had been exiled from her own people, but here, among the stars, she had been given something greater than she ever imagined. She was no longer lost. The first time Alara stepped onto Dracona Prime, it took her breath away. The planet was unlike anything she had ever seen. Mountains that pierced the clouds, rivers that glowed like molten silver, entire cities built within the spires of towering crystal formations. The air was warmer here, charged with something ancient, something alive. Kaler rode on her shoulder, his wings fluttering lightly as he chirped in excitement. He had grown stronger, his once weak frame now sturdy, his eyes bright with intelligence. She had spent her entire life believing she would serve in sterile, white-walled hospitals following human regulations, working under strict laws, and yet, here she was, stepping onto the homeworld of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, not as a visitor, but as one of them. Lysara led the way, her presence commanding yet calm. As they walked through the massive gates of the Healer Temple, Alara felt dozens of eyes on her. Some were curious, others wary. "The humans abandoned her," she heard one whisper. "And yet, she still chooses to heal," another murmured. Alara straightened her spine. Let them talk. She had spent years proving herself, and she would do it again. Inside the temple, the air was hushed, reverent. The walls were adorned with the history of draconian healers. Stories of those who had mended wounds, saved lives, changed the course of history itself. Lysara gestured toward the center of the chamber, where a pool of glowing water rippled softly, pure energy swirling within. "This is where your journey begins," the queen said, "a sacred oath binding your life to our peoples." Alara hesitated only for a second, then she stepped forward. The moment her fingertips touched the water, a surge of warmth flooded through her, as if the planet itself was acknowledging her, welcoming her. The whispers behind her stilled, and when she turned, she saw the Draconians, watching her differently now, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. Lysara nodded, satisfaction in her gaze. "Welcome home, Alara." Alara looked down at Kaler, who let out a soft, contented trill. home. For the first time in her life, she finally understood what that meant.